I'm Steve Orlins, president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm thrilled to welcome Victor Shih. Victor is a professor at the University of California, San Diego, and is one of America's leading experts on China's politics and economics in the United States. You have his bio on the website, but let me just add one very important part of his bio, which he is a member of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. He became a member, a fellow in 2014, and what he's doing today in taking this interview on the Lianghui, the National People's Congress meeting and the China People's Consultative Conference meetings, which just ended, is in continuing fulfillment of that obligation of being a public intellectual. He is really one of the most sought after speakers on these issues in America today. So let's start. The two meetings just ended. Were there any surprises to you in the meetings?
There were no big surprises. I mean, I think a lot of people, myself, a little bit, although I wouldn't put myself in that camp, were surprised by the growth target that was announced, 5.5%. Which is a bit aggressive. There was a time, as you well remember, sort of 10 years ago when 6-7% growth was pretty normal in China. But in recent year, because of the emphasis on deleveraging in the Chinese economy, and more recently, of course, the COVID shock to the world and also to China, growth had slowed down in China. And also, as China becomes such a large economy, it is the second largest economy in the world, growth naturally would slow down. So announcing a 5.5% growth rate is a little bit aggressive.
Li Keqiang, and he obviously announced the growth rate. He also announced, "This is my last year as premier," which we knew, but I don't recall previous premiers in their last year making that announcement at the National People's Congress. Was this unusual?
Yeah, so to make announcements on personnel issues is a little bit unusual, especially for an official who's I'll put young, as young as Li Keqiang is doing. He will have his birthday in July. When he will turn 67. So according to all of our understanding of the informal rules dictating retirement within the Chinese Communist Party, for an official in the Politburo Standing Committee, 67 entitles you another 5-year term in the Politburo Standing Committee. So by saying that, oh, I'm not going to be premier anymore, we know this. The state constitution does place a limit on, terms of premier. It's unclear what he's saying, right? So is he saying that he's going to also step down from the Politburo Standing Committee, or will he go the way of Li Peng, who, as you will recall, served, I believe, 2 terms, so 13th and 14th as premier of China, and then became the head of the National People's Congress. If the age rule is adhered, Li Keqiang, this could well be the next step for Li Keqiang, that he will be the chair of the National People's Congress or the chair of the CPPCC.
Yeah. Possible that he would just stay on the standing committee and not have another role? Or pretty much everybody, I mean, Wang Huning has no real official role. Pretty much everybody else does. Is it possible to kind of just stay on the standing committee?
Yeah, so given that, he's worked in the state council now for such a long time, remember also he was vice premier under Wen Jiabao. I don't think it's likely that he would take a position in kind of the more party affairs side of the Politburo Standing Committee, being, in charge of propaganda, as you point out, so I think a more likely outcome would be either being the chair of the NPC or CPPCC, or he may be forced into retirement.
Yeah.
This is kind of what happened to Li Yuanchao. he retired before he turned 67.
The CPCCC and the NPC, did they? I mean, each of those is viewed as a lesser job than premier, so it's kind of somewhat interesting that he would move, and would he stay as number 2 in the standing committee, which he currently is. So, very interesting questions. Did either of these meetings shed any light on who Li Keqiang's successor would be?
Not clearly, and I think that is one of the big open questions. So, in terms of just factional affiliation, of course, we can say, well, Liu He would be great, but Liu He, I believe, is maybe even older than Li Keqiang himself. And so, if you go by the rule of 68 or above, then you have to step down from the Politburo, then Liu He should not get another term. But I think it's also entirely possible that Xi Jinping may relax some of the rules that have been governing retirement and promotion within the Chinese Communist Party. He certainly, as the most powerful leader in China by far, and probably the most powerful central leader since Chairman Mao himself, he has the authority to relax the retirement rules, but it's unclear. But, so I think, yeah, it is a big puzzle, and I haven't looked at it super carefully, but if it's not Liu He, then it's hard to, think about who it might be. It might be one of the current provincial leaders who gets then switched over to the position of premier, and there are precedents for that. So Zhao Ziyang was a provincial leader, and then suddenly one day he found himself as the premier of China. People sort of complain about that, back in the 80s, like, oh, he didn't come from the state council, he doesn't really know how to run the bureaucracy. But since 1978, there has been some precedents. So then if one of the provincial leaders will become premier, then you have a lot of candidates, Chen Xi, Li Xi, the guy at Chen Minar, right, in Chongqing, Cai Ji, all of these current Politburo members are potential candidates to replace Li Keqiang.
He Lifeng?
And He Li. Well, so He Lifeng, you're right. Although from in the state council code, right, he's currently head of NDRC. He has not had any experience as vice premier of China, which was a surprise, right? So I had expected him to become vice premier in the current term after 19th Party Congress. He didn't make that. I think it is possible that they could suddenly jump him into the premier seat. But judging from sort of historical precedents, there's I think more of a precedent of a senior provincial leader of a big province jumping into the premier seat than a state council minister.
More likely he would replace Liu He as
That's
the vice
right.
premier
That's
in charge
vice
of
premier.
economic
Yes.
consumption. Yes, that would be
Yes.
my total speculation. I have no inside information on that. The elephant in the room, which was barely discussed at the both of the meetings, was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How, I did hear from some delegates that there was a lot of what they call corridor discussions of that, but very little from the platform. How did it affect the discussions? We see this humanitarian tragedy, literally of proportions, which it's been decades and decades, maybe not, that we've seen something like this. And it seemed to be, by and large, except for Li Keqiang's comment at the very end, which we are concerned about it without criticism of Russia. How did it affect the discussions and the agenda? And Wang Yi's, interview.
Long interview, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the way that the war is going was definitely not anticipated by the top leadership in China. They might have been, well anticipated military action in Ukraine. I think Putin, when he was in Beijing, talked to Xi Jinping most likely sort of about it. But you know, from what I see in the news, at least, like Putin himself had expected a relatively quick campaign, and so that likely he conveyed that to Xi Jinping. The fact that it's long and drawn out, the fact that many civilians in Ukraine are getting killed, the fact that, you know, Russia is throwing the entirety of the 200,000 troops it has stationed along the borders into Ukraine, and the fact that there's been very unified and pretty severe Western sanctions against Russia are all surprises to the leadership. So basically, you know, the NPC is something that's planned throughout the year. They could not have changed course and you know, introduce Ukraine into its agenda so quickly. So I'm not surprised that we didn't see very much about it at the NPC. For Wang Yi, I think that was especially a very challenging thing for him to articulate China's position, because he has to walk this very fine line between obviously supporting Russia as a close ally of China, but at the same time, not alienating China from the rest of the international community, and also not deviating so far away from China's long-standing position against using military force to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries, of sovereign nations in the United Nations, which of course Ukraine is a part of the United Nations and is a sovereign country. So I mean, Steve, you probably has much greater experience on that front than myself. What do you make of all the?
Do you think Wang Yi succeeded?
No, because with every day that passes, you know, the whole notion that this is police action or whatever you want to call it, just becomes kind of ridiculous. And you know, so China is forced into a choice between being a consistent and good ally of Russia, and outright saying that it is 强权政治, right, as they say in China, rule of the strong, that because Russia has the military power, it is entitled to intervene in the take over territories from other countries. And, you know, is China going to outright and back that position? You know, I find that that would be a very difficult proposition for China.
Yeah, I think they're trying to walk a line that is not walkable. That, and especially as we're seeing, you know, it was not walkable at the inception. So, you know, 17 days ago, it wasn't walkable. And now as the war has progressed and we've seen, you know, vastly increasing civilian deaths, you know, 2.5 million refugees, deaths of children, you know, maternity hospitals being bombed, the position is not sustainable. So I wonder, and the NPC, obviously, it was not, you're exactly right, it was not the place to deal with this, but that's not the place to deal with. Well, where are they going to deal with it? Are they going to convene a standing committee or a Politburo meeting to basically say, we need to rein the Russians in, that you know, we're on the wrong side of history here. We really are destroying any soft power we ever had. You know, we're going to be left with two allies in the world, Russia and North Korea, and we'll be on the outside. And ultimately, given, and you know tons about it, China's economic integration in the world, this will be really, really bad for China. I'm not sure that the leadership understands that yet. Discussions I have every night suggest that it has not reached the top, and I'm deeply worried, because obviously the implications for China's relationship with the rest of the world, and most importantly, the United States, are going to deteriorate beyond the Chinese leadership's imagination. That if they continue to not try and rein in the Russians, they're even seen as complicit, it is going to be a disaster for US-China relations. Back to the NPC, you know, the common prosperity which we've been hearing so much about. Did I miss something, or was it kind of missing in the NPC speeches?
Yeah, it's very
What does
much
that mean?
missing. In fact, I mean, you almost saw a little bit of the opposite. Yeah, so common prosperity, we understand that as kind of more effort to share the gains of China's economic growth more equally by potentially increasing taxes on the rich and corporations and redistributing some of it to social welfare programs. We have seen, so the word common prosperity, I don't think was mentioned, once, in Li Keqiang's, maybe once, but very, very few times. But even the policies that you would think is associated with common prosperity, we are not seeing very much of it. Even the most basic thing, which was very much discussed in the run-up to the NPC session, property tax, was completely not talked about. So in Li Keqiang's speech, there was some discussion that, quoting Xi Jinping's sort of speech from a few years ago, that real estate is to live in, not for speculation. That was quoted, and say, okay, our policies will continue to encourage that use of real estate for real people living in it, but not for speculation. But then that's it. Very vague wording, it's just kind of like, oh, we should encourage, some leasing programs, basically the same things they talked about year after year after year, oh, you have to prevent property prices from rising too fast. The real policies that would have made a real dent on that issue was property tax, which was completely not discussed. And property tax also would have served common prosperity, the program, quite well, because it is a progressive tax, right? So you're taxing people with a lot of wealth, with multiple apartments that are sitting there empty. And with the money, the local governments, whether it be the city or the provinces, would have been able to finance more welfare programs at the local level, for which there is a lack of funding right now. And then at the NPC speech, there was not a lot of explicit discussion about dramatically raising welfare provision, either on the medical front or for elderly or for the disabled. We see that, it's not to say that there was no discussion. There was some discussion, but it's the usual pleasantry that, oh, we're going to 争取, we're going to do better on these different programs. Not a lot of specific targets on, 20-30% increase in welfare spending or anything like that. So yeah, I think common prosperity is not in the front burner at this point.
Why?
Why? I think, the leadership, for some reason, realizes that growth remains a really key objective for the entire Chinese Communist Party. And I think the basic reason is that Xi Jinping would like to say soon, either in his next term or in the term after that, that the Chinese economy is now larger than the US economy. And without growth, you can't have that. And so the orientation is shifting a little bit back on a focus on, maintaining growth at 5.5%, which, at least according to, if you believe in official statistics in China, that's a whole different issue, will allow China to surpass the United States before 2030. Let's say, I don't know the exact year, what it would be, but if you relax on growth, you focus too much on social welfare. I mean, by the way, actually, social welfare transfers, it does generate growth, but not in the way that China is used to maintaining growth, which is more through the export and investment side than through final consumption. But the focus is shifted back on maintaining the usual engine of growth for China, which is infrastructure and real estate investment. And then recently, export has done extremely well, and then pouring more investment in technology investment. This
So
is
interesting. I think that analysis is absolutely right. But what puzzles me is obviously the war in Ukraine is going to affect growth. It really is going to affect growth, and it's going to
not
affect
necessarily. Not
not necessarily.
not necessarily. So I think
Global growth will be affected by this. I think the increase in energy prices is going to affect it. I think the restrictions, the sanctions are going to affect it. It's going to affect it in China's trading partners and in China. Tell me why it won't.
yeah, so all the headwinds you mentioned, they will exist. But Russia has always been a small market for China anyway, so it doesn't really affect that much. If growth in Europe and the United States were to slow down meaningfully, then I agree, it's going to hit the export side. But remember, the kind of trade component of growth of GDP calculation is net export. So imagine, a huge category of import for China is energy, oil and gas, right? So oil and gas prices are going up outside of Russia. But if China were to shift its purchases of oil and gas entirely to Russia and just say, well, the world doesn't want your oil and gas, we'll buy it from you, but at a 30% discount to world prices, that actually will save China on the import side. So even if export were to slow down a little bit, the net export, the trade surplus China will enjoy potentially will be the same or even larger. And that's going to help with its growth.
Yeah, and certainly the deal they made on natural gas suggests that it is a very significant discount that China is buying from Russia, which is, again, it may be a good economic deal. It's putting China on the wrong side of history. Were there any messages in the NPC for foreigners, or it's basically a domestic event and they don't really much care about what foreigners think about what's going on?
So I think there's Li Keqiang, I think is a wily politician. He knows he's not sort of powerful within the party, but what he has done is that he has projected a very consistent message from the State Council, not just this year, but in the past few years, of trying to help businesses out, both foreign and domestic. So he's hit on, as you well know, he's hit on the themes of cutting red tapes from the Chinese government, reducing taxes and fees, and for Chinese exporters, providing still a very high level of export rebates to firms that export from China. And it's been extremely consistent, during the time that he has served as the premier of China. Whereas, what we've seen Xi Jinping do is like, oh, we want deleveraging. So, oh, no, we don't want deleveraging. Oh, we don't want high real estate prices now. It's like, oh, no. Actually, maybe real estate can continue as it has. So there's been a lot more kind of volatility, if you will, in Xi Jinping's policymaking style. Whereas what we've seen for Li Keqiang is extremely consistent. Help businesses. Of course, the past 2 years or so, fight COVID, also extremely consistent. And I think as the discussion gets going on what role Li Keqiang will play after the 20th Party Congress, this kind of consistency may serve him well in the internal discussion.
Interesting. Defense spending is going up 7.1%, far in excess of general spending increase. How should we kind of think about that?
Well, the official defense spending money budget has always been suspect, I would say. So I don't take too much stock in that number, just because there's so many other ways that defense spending is fed through. There are all these channels, like through the financial system, that can sell spending. But the 7% increase, I wouldn't be too alarmed by it, because inflation in reality in China is quite high. So a 7% increase in reality, maybe like a 2%, 3% increase in real term. What is definitely happening is that expenditure in a lot of other categories are actually decreasing in real terms, right? So a lot of the social welfare, the one that I looked at carefully recently, rural spending, there's a category of expenditure called rural and forestry expenditure, which is basically county level subsidies to farmers. That is negative 10% growth, even in nominal terms. So in real terms is, declining by 15%. Across many local governments in China, they don't have a lot of fiscal flexibility anymore. So they're cutting expenses across the board for defense because it's centrally financed almost entirely. The central government still has a pretty strong balance sheet, and so it is able to grow that expenditure. But I think the growth rate probably has slowed down relative to previous years. I remember that used to grow by sort of 10, 15% a year. We're not seeing that.
Of course, when the economy and the budget was growing at much faster rates also.
Exactly, yeah. So I don't think that's unusually alarming or not alarming. It's just going normally, I would say.
And I guess what many point out is internal security expenses exceed defense expenses. So that's always the interesting kind of metric. The not much talk. What was there much talk about? Peak carbon emissions and more kind of focus on green technology, more investing in green technology. Was there reaffirmation of the goals of when they're going to peak and when they're going to be carbon neutral?
So I'm not the expert in this, but from what I hear from Michael Davidson, who's a Pitt Fellow, I think this year, I think the word is that it's pretty much the same. Definitely, I think China for a while had this very explicit target of reaching, peak carbon certain year, and then carbon neutrality decades later. There's probably less of a talk of that as the leadership refocuses on growth. So I think kind of Xi Jinping, for whatever reason, may not have realized, may not have focused on this issue, but then someone must have reminded him that, in order for our economy to be larger than the US economy, we need to do the following, and being overly strict on emission may not be helpful. So I think that's kind of the spirit in which a lot of these kinds of issues, carbon emission is being discussed.
Do you think they're that focused on becoming larger than the US economy? You think that really matters to them?
I really think it does, to Xi Jinping. And it's not a new thing. I mean, this has been a key objective. And, when I could visit China, before COVID, of course, there were always like a lot of different policy objectives. But if you ask people in the think tank world and academics in China, they will always say that, yeah, that's true, but we still need growth. Growth is no longer the only objective, but it has to reach a certain level.
They need growth for political stability as opposed to exceeding the United States. It's funny. I maybe it's because I talk to people who are generally pro-constructive engagement, and they wouldn't want to say that, but it's not. I cannot recall hearing that from a senior Chinese that, our economic plan is designed so that our economy is bigger than the United States in 2030. Our economic plan is used to be to lift all Chinese out of poverty. Now that they've achieved that, it's very much to provide for a middle income country. And that's the goal of it. They don't generally talk to me about becoming larger than the United States. In fact, they would explicitly say, whatever if you use PPP measure, we're already larger.
Yeah.
If
right. So why isn't that
but it's not.
Yeah. So why have growth targets anymore? In fact, the growth targets exist. They're very important. I mean, even if they have to twist the statistics or whatever, they have to reach their growth targets.
Yeah.
And the reason is because China, surpassed the United States, is still an important objective, or at least is a vital stepping stone to realizing the China dream. And the China dream has, my read of it, it has two components. One is very domestically focused, getting people out of poverty and, having people enjoy a wide variety of aspects in their lives. But another part of it is very comparative. Like China wants to be a key actor in the world, shaping international institutions. But from a Marxist perspective, you need the materialist foundation of that before you can reshape global order, et cetera, because all that stuff is superstructural. And the underlying substructure is economic growth.
Yeah. We can have a whole separate, we can do a whole separate program on those issues, as there may be some dissenting opinion on that. But let's close with the COVID question. How, when I spoke with the delegates, they were in a bubble. So all the delegates lived in, even if they were Beijing delegates, they lived in a sequestered hotel. How did that affect the meetings? And now that we're seeing, a rapid spread of COVID within China because the Omicron variant, how is that going to affect things going forward?
Yeah, so I think this is a big issue. I sense this is a bit of a tea leaf reading, and I may not be right. So compared to the last year's NPC speech, we still have the same kind of overall objective of protecting China from overseas infections, cases, imported cases, and also prevent the rise of domestic transmission. So those two phrases are still in the report. But what I've detected is that this year, there's a greater focus on vaccination and developing pharmaceuticals that will address the serious symptoms of COVID. So I think that's kind of a new thing. And part of it is because sort of medical technological development last year was not as advanced as it is this year, both domestically and also overseas. So potentially, of course, none of the policies will be relaxed prior to the 20th Party Congress, especially in Beijing. Beijing is already increasingly in very strict lockdown mode. I had some interaction with people at Schwarzman, where I'm doing some teaching now, and they're not in complete lockdown yet, but they're certainly heading in that direction. So I think Beijing and the rest of China will be under extremely strict quarantine policies. After the 20th Party Congress, there is some signs that maybe China will switch to a slightly more flexible set of policies that involve really, booster shots, rolling out booster shots across the board. Hopefully booster shots using mRNA technology, some of it imported, hopefully, to address this kind of US-China trade balance, and either importing or developing its own pharmaceuticals that will be effective in treating COVID symptoms. If these pieces are in place, I can imagine sort of a year and a half or so from now, there will be meaningful relaxation in cross-border travel in and out of China. At least that's the hopeful scenario.
That's the hopeful scenario. Wow. The less hopeful scenario is this remains in place forever. This has been a fabulous discussion. You have completely lived up to the goals we set for our public intellectual fellows. This has been terrific. I should mention that Victor has a book coming out from Cambridge University Press, which is called Coalitions of the Week, which will come out, I guess, in the next few weeks. So we look forward.
Now they say May, so come on.
Hey, okay. Well, we look for when it comes out. We look forward to our next interview of you. But this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Steve.